Hello everybody and welcome back to another week in review, this time of 3rd US Armored, Spearhead, and 28th Jager, suggested a few weeks back by Malquitas TW. Remember that if you'd like to see any specific divisions covered in this series, be sure to leave them in the comments and I'll add them to the end of the list in chronological order, or I'll route you to where they already exist. But without any ado, let's hop right into 3rd US Armored, Spearhead. This is another division that I've had a lot of experience with as it launched with the game proper, and as an American, I'm kind of drawn to playing American decks in these sort of World War II games. That said, there's really never been anything that's kept me in this division. As far as I'm concerned, and this is still the case even after playing it all week, I think that everything this deck does, 2nd Indian Head just does better, and so it kind of loses a lot of luster there. However, I started it off by bringing in one card of the M8s in the recon tab. I toyed around with bringing in other M8s as well, but honestly, just the one card of M8s seemed to do just fine, and being that these guys couldn't push front lines, being that they're recon units, I wasn't able to get a lot of sweet surrenders with them as I usually use the M8s for. That said, the M8 is a ridiculously good unit. This is my first time in this series proper reviewing the M8 as a unit, and these guys are absolutely insane. They travel incredibly quickly on roads. They pack an excellent gun for their point cost and for their speed. They have an amount of armor, but that's really not their selling point, and they also sport a way to support infantry with their machine gun. These things are just excellent at heading off every single deck that gets them opening and just shelling out enemy infantry before they're able to unload, enemy AT guns, or even light vehicles. Moving on in the infantry tab, which is always one of the hardest parts to balance about playing 3rd US Armored. I have 6 engineers in Phase A, that is one card coming in at no stars. They are coming in the MT5 half-track. Honest to God, the best part about this division is actually the half-tracks though. The half-tracks are such that they're incapable of being damaged by small arms fire, and because of that, they're actually incredibly dangerous in forests or the like. I can't count the number of times that I've been completely shut down by these half-tracks just because I have no way to deal with them, especially being that Axis infantry don't all come with a way to deal with these lighter transport. If you think about it, on the Allies team, you have things like the Guardia or Strelky DP, which come in with PTRD or PTRSs that are capable of shelling these things out from 500 meters out. On top of this, bazookas or the Panzerschreck teams that you're capable of sometimes getting will make quick work of these also. But if you think about it on the Axis, aside from certain niche decks here and there, you're incapable of getting anything like the PTRS to deal with these sorts of units, and so you're resorted to either using Panzerschrecks, which can either be very dangerous or very expensive, or using light vehicles, which again could be very dangerous or very expensive, especially being that most of the US infantry come with bazookas of their own. I think the ideal way to use these infantry is to really press the advantage granted to you by having these half-tracks, just in the fact that most German infantry will be completely incapable of dealing with them until about 100 meters out. Moving on, I have the aforementioned Army Rifles coming in at one card in Phase A, also coming in the half-tracks. The Army Rifles are special simply because they pack a bazooka, and there aren't many line infantry in this game that actually come with a dedicated anti-tank tool that can be used at 250 meters. In Phase B, I bring in another card of the Army Rifles, and a card of the Army LMG Rifles. The Army LMG Rifles are just that. They only come in with 2 bars, and they're excellent at killing infantry, but they do not come with a bazooka, so they're a very niche unit in their own way. And lastly, in Phase C, I bring in one card of the Army Rifles with the bar. These guys, a little bit different than the LMGs, come with a bar, a different bar than the earlier one, but still come with the bazooka from the earlier units. So I figured the more of these I could have, the better, as they're probably the most versatile units in this entire tab. Moving on to the tank tab, it's fairly standard, although I did make a few huge mistakes in my initial deck, but we'll get to those as we get there. I bring in a Phase A card of the typical Sherman M4A1, 60 points, 4 per card at 1-star veterancy, and I did upvet them simply because I only lost 1 for the upvetting, and it seemed like a reasonable trade to me. I also brought in a card of the M4A1 76s. practically the same unit as the M4A1, save for the gun, which gets upgraded to 130mm penetration, making this a very dangerous machine indeed. While 130mm isn't going to win you any awards, especially at max range, at close range this is a huge step up from the 90mm penetration present on the typical 75mm gun found on most Shermans. Because of this, a couple of these ambushing a Tiger are more than likely to win, especially when supported by some of your other units, such as the Jumbo tanking shots from the Tiger. Also in Phase A, the aforementioned Jumbo. I bring these in at no stars because I honestly don't care if the Jumbo ever hits anything in its entire life. The Jumbo's only purpose in any of my decks that get access to them is to absorb ammunition. It has an absurdly high front armor that makes it capable of absorbing shots even from long 88s at 2 kilometers, though I wouldn't really advise this as they do still have some chance to penetrate. This renders them all but invulnerable to things like Tigers, even at close range against Tigers, simply because of their absurdly high front armor. If you use these as your front line that the enemy is capable of seeing, they're going to absorb all of the AT and tank fire, allowing your Sherman 76s and regular Shermans to clean up all of those things that I just mentioned. Aside from this, the Sherman Jumbo only brings in the 75mm gun, making it only a 90mm penetration, so it's kind of worthless at killing any vehicles. However, with that high front armor, you can just drive it right up against enemy infantry, and if you roll the dice just properly, the Jumbo will block shots from Panzerfausts. That is hardly advisable though. I really wouldn't drive these up to infantry as there's really no reason to, but you could. In Phase B, I started off with another card of the M4A1 Shermans, and this is probably my biggest mistake in this deck, is bringing in the M4A1s instead of the M4A1Ws, but we'll get to that when I get to the deck at the end of the week. I also bring in a M4A176 Commander, and this was mainly to have another 76, though it was nice to have the command stat also. Finally, I grabbed another card of Jumbos in Phase B, as bringing these in Phase C seemed like overkill. I didn't really need that many of them, so I stuck with just 6 and they seemed to work out just fine. Lastly, in Phase C, I brought in the M4A1 just to round it out. Now, it's worth noting at this point, because I forgot to mention it earlier, that this deck was a vanguard deployment. I made it specifically for sort of these early game rushes with Shermans that this deck is capable of, and I think that it's uniquely suited toward that exact play type. Moving on to the support tab, I bring in the flamethrowers in the 4 GPA, just to try and get them to the fronts faster, and a card of the M1919 machine guns, just pinned down in enemy infantry, as machine guns are kind of overpowered right now. I also bring in M8 Scots in the support tab. This was mainly to have some more M8s, but their HE capabilities are actually quite strong, all things considered, so they were nice to have at 25 points. I brought in a Phase A commander and a rather unique unit. Now, a lot of veterans are likely to know this already about Spearhead. However, it is unique in that it is capable of bringing in leaders, not just commanders, in the support tab. It is the only deck like that in the game currently. These Command M8s are a very special unit. That said, I was using them mainly just to surrender things out after artillery landed on them or off map or whatever it may be, just because it's still an M8 and it still moves very, very quickly. However, it also pushes front line, unlike the earlier recon versions. In Phase B, I bring in the GMC supply truck, and to round out the supply tab, I bring in a M4A3 105W. These guys are just your typical 105 Shermans, however they do pack heat shells capable of penetrating 100mm of armor at any range. This actually makes them quite deadly against things like Panthers or Tigers, especially if you got them in an ambush roll or if you have multiples of them. While this hardly guarantees a kill, it is nice to supplement your 76s or your regular Shermans with these if you're running low on the other variants. In the anti-tank tab, I bring in a Phase A card of the bazookas in the regular Jeep transport. 8 per card, the bazookas are just great to scatter around everywhere, and even if only one of them gets a kill, it's typically enough to afford the entire lot of them. I also bring in a card of Phase A and a card of Phase B M1 57mm guns. These are some of my favorite guns in the game, and while they lack the APCR from the 6-pound gun found in the British divisions, they do still have an absurd 115mm of penetration AP shell, and they're nearly invisible due to their low man and their high stealth rating. In the anti-air tab, I thought, Mobility was the best thing that I could bring in, and so I stuck with it and brought in a Phase A and a Phase C card of the M15 GGMCs, and in Phase B I brought in the M16. Now the M16 is practically the same as the Russian M17. It's for kind of close-ranged, very, very fast-firing weapons that are capable of turning planes around so long as your guns are very close to the front, and the M15s are my more long-ranged option. My main plan with these was just to drive the M16s up with my main force and keep the M15s back in cover like I would with a Zenart or whatnot, and just move them after every time they've revealed themselves to avoid enemy battery. In the artillery tab, I brought in the M21 mortar carriers in Phase A, 100 points, and these guys fire at a very, very tight target, are capable of moving to avoid counter battery, and pack an incredible amount of ammunition in them. I typically didn't resupply them because the games didn't go on long enough for that, but I found that these guys were excellent at pinning down infantry that I was having trouble dealing with. I also brought in a card of M4A1 OP 155mm off-map carriers because, again, I like to get those early footholds. The 155s are more than enough, and at the time, I thought that these guys had the Sherman gun on them. However, it appears they've been nerfed to only include 2 machine guns. My plan was to use it as an off-map capability and then use it as a Sherman right after that, but it didn't really work out that way, and I ended up just using it as a machine gun carrier instead. In Phase B, I bring in my first infantry leader of the division in the form of the artillery commanders. However, I hardly ever use these on actual infantry. I was using them mainly just to buff my 76s, keep them in forests nearby, or even my AA. In the last tab, I brought in the P51D TAC 5 in Phase A, 3 per card at 130 points, and they do drop fairly significant munitions while doubling as a fighter. These things are pretty great, honestly. In Phases B and C, I brought in the B26, and this was just to deal with things that I had no other way to deal with, such as King Tigers or ridiculous things that I just have no option but to bomb to death. Moving on to my division at the end of the week, not much has changed in the first 2 tabs. The Recon and Infantry tab did see changes throughout the week, but I ended up reverting back to the original values just because it ended up being the better way to do it. In the tank tab, I swapped out the M4A1 for the M4A3 75mm W. It doesn't grab any additional penetration, but the Ws are faster and they have more armor, and they're only 5 points more, so it was kind of silly of me not to bring them in the first place. The rest of the deck really didn't experience any changes. I toyed around for a little while bringing in the Bofors, the stationary guns, in the AA tab, but that didn't really stick. And past that, I toyed around with a few of the other planes, but the B-26s just ended up doing the job the best for me, so I stuck with them. If you're looking at this division and you're disgusted because I didn't bring in any long toms, I'd like to remind you that I was playing it as a Maverick deployment, and honestly, I don't want to spend an entire tick of my Phase A income on a long tom just to have it potentially do something when I could spend that same tick on 2 Sherman 76s that will definitely do something. I think the long toms are excellent in Indian Head, however, not so much in a vanguard deployment of Spearhead. On top of this, I really didn't use the mortar carriers all that much either. The mortar carriers were really nice when I did use them, however, I found that Shermans were almost always a better option to bring in during this phase, especially being that 10 points more got me a jumbo, and the jumbo will just absorb shots until it dies, or more likely until the heat death of the universe, or until the 76s kill whatever's shooting at it, whichever comes first. The AA tab was okay, however, the AA in this division is a little lackluster, especially in the current meta. If the enemy brought in a sufficient enough air force, then I was just going to run out of ammo on the M16s, and eventually those bombs were going to start going through. Resupplying the M16s was its own can of worms, to use an expression. Because I was able to take so much forward ground, being that it was a Maverick deployment and being that Shermans are just that good at taking forward ground, it was very difficult for me to get supply trucks up to my M16s, and I found that people who had auto-target supplies turned on in their gameplay section were really wrecking me just with AT guns that were set up in a way that was behind the bulk of my force, but stopping all reinforcements from getting up there. So I had to kind of do this weird clear out the enemy forests and then bring up the reinforcements or the supplies for my M16. I also really didn't find myself using the M1s all that often. Being that I was pushing so very hard, there was hardly any time for an enemy counterattack, though I did use them occasionally, especially when I achieved an enemy spawn. The really interesting part about this division, or Panther divisions, or really any medium tank flavored division, is that all of these medium tanks tend to hit sort of a critical mass where they've become unstoppable simply due to their sheer multitude. If ever there was a time that all three of my Sherman 76s survived Phase A and moved on to Phase B, then that was kind of that critical mass, because if I had more Sherman 76s on the way, there was almost nothing they could do to stop me. On top of this, it really doesn't matter if the jumbo goes down, so I typically kept that far away from the bulk of my units. If you keep the jumbo far away, then the enemy is going to continue to fire at that because the AI intentionally fires at what it considers the most dangerous target. Sometimes it bases this danger simply based on the front armor of the unit. Because of this, you can just have it over there absorbing shots forever from whatever is on the enemy team. Newer players also note that they tend to use a lot of cluster munitions or rocket bombers to try and kill these jumbos as they register them as a threat. However, nothing can be further from the truth. The jumbo is probably the least threatening part of this army. It's only here as a wall of meat, and it does that job incredibly well, especially if you buy a plane to stop it. If you spent any amount of points to kill the jumbo beyond that you would have already spent to fight tanks, then you're really playing into Third Armor's hands. At one point, I stopped an entire advance simply by putting a jumbo on a road that was staring at a King Tiger, and the King Tiger kept moving forward, firing, moving back, moving forward, firing. This went on for about 10-15 minutes until we just won on other fronts, and the jumbo was still there to tell the tale. Another thing that I might see myself into changing if I had any longer to play with this deck is probably dropping the bazooka team. The bazooka teams are nice to have, however, all of my infantry have bazookas, so I hardly ever left them alone without any AT support. Because of this, I oftentimes ended a game with all 8 of my bazooka cards inside of my deck, just I didn't have anywhere to put them. They could be really nice to sneak past front lines, but I found that front lines were already being sneaked past by the sheer amount of infantry and Shermans that I had, that it just wasn't necessary to bring in the bazookas. On top of this, in the anti-tank tab, the main reason I didn't bring in any other weapons, such as the M5 gun, is because the M5 was simply too slow. The M1 does practically everything the M5 does, minus having a better penetration value and an APCR shell and an HE shell, so that doesn't sound like everything, but it is. When I bring in the M1 gun, I know exactly what I'm getting. When I bring in the M5 gun, I'm getting sort of a versatile unit, as it were. However, it's an expensive, slow, and unstealthy versatile unit that's just going to get itself killed. I'm not disputing that there are great uses for the M5 gun, just simply that I don't enjoy using the M5 gun, as the M1 gun almost always does the same job, but better. I honestly had a lot of fun playing this division as a vanguard deployment. I did toy around with making a different deployment types and making a balanced deployment for this same deck. However, I kept coming back to the vanguard as it seemed the most fun, and one time I made a juggernaut deck that was just scummy and had 1,000 artillery pieces, and I didn't like that at all. Aside from that, this deck does very well in 2v2s and 3v3s, if only struggling a little bit in 4v4s simply because it loses a lot of its luster as a vanguard deployment if one of your allies is doing poorly. It's kind of an all or nothing division. If one of your allies falls apart, then the entire luster of having a vanguard deployment falls apart with it, and you kind of just end up in Phase C buried under a field of artillery and aircraft and wondering what happened. However, that's really not an indictment on the deck, simply that's just the way the game is played. I dare not try to rank this division in 1v1s, as each time that I attempt to rank it in 1v1s, the exact opposite of what I think should be true is actually true. This just goes to show you that my 1v1 chops really need to be worked on. However, in team games, I feel like this deck is good enough. As I said in the onset, 2nd Indian Head is just a better version of this deck. It has a lot of the same units available to it from the air tab, minus the B-26s, a nearly identical AT tab, a nearly identical support tab, and maybe plus or minus a few things in the tank tab. The tank tab, where this deck is ostensibly meant to shine, is kind of lackluster in certain ways. It's excellent at mid-ranged engagements or helping your infantry, but it's not great as far as armored divisions go for fighting over open fields. I think with this division, your best bet is to get in there very quickly, get right up in your enemy's face, and just shove these Shermans down their throat as much as humanly possible. On top of that, you're backing them up with excellent bazooka-wielding line infantry that are going to beat most anything they come up against with their half-track support or with the Sherman support, and you're backing it up with an excellent air force to boot. So all in all, I'd rate this deck as easier to play the more aggressive player you are. If you're an incredibly aggressive player, then I think you're going to really enjoy this deck. It's got everything that you need if you're going to be right up in the enemy's face. However, if you're a more defensive player, I might recommend going to one of the other NATO divisions, such as 2nd Indian Head, which has a lot more defensive options. Moving on to 28th Jager, and God help us all. I started out in the recon tab bringing in a phase A and a phase B card of the Scharfschütze, which are just excellent sniper units. Among blue, it's very rare that you get a sniper unit outside of Romania, and so any chance I get to bring them in, it's always coming in, no matter what. If you're wondering why I've skipped the KFZ4, it's because I had 1 point left over at the end of my build of the initial deck, and so I just decided to throw points into that. It's just 2 MG34s mounted to a Jeep, and it's okay, it's fine. It doesn't do anything that you wouldn't think it would. It's killed by small arms or enemy MG34s, so it almost always just died without doing anything, and that was fine. For 10 points, that's fine. In the infantry tab, we have the Ersatztruppen coming in phase A, and I'm going to say this, it's going to sound like a joke, but it's dead serious. The Ersatztruppen are your best mid-ranged engagement infantry in this deck, period. Aside from the Ersatztruppen, you have access to Jaeger and Sturmjäger, who all have at max a 300 meter range, barring their few long-ranged weapons such as their LMGs. Because of this, the Ersatztruppen with all their Kar 98s are excellent at mid-ranged engagements comparatively to your other units. There's something to be said in the fact that I could have brought in Jaeger Pioneer, which pack a ton of Kar 98s and would have been excellent replacements to any of these units in mid-range, but I just couldn't really take the availability hit. Past that in phase A, I bring in the Jaeger and the Jaeger Führer, as well as a card of 2-star Sturmjäger. Now the Sturmjäger perform just as well as I thought they would, being that they're just a pile of MP44s, they have an LMG, and that's really it. Supported by Jägerführers or any sort of leadership boost, bringing these guys up to 3 stars really made them just overperform over most enemy infantry, especially on the ally side. On top of this, the Jaeger are just piles of MP40s with an LMG, so they were almost as good, but within that 100 meter range instead of 300 meter range. The issue that I had with this infantry tab is simply that the number of engagements that you can get into that are 300 meters or 100 meters are very, very small, all things considered. Especially when each of these units packs an LMG that they'll open fire with at 750 or 500 meters and really ruin themselves in getting in engagements that they weren't prepared for against units much better suited for it. In phase B, I bring in 2 cards of 1-star Jaeger and another card of the 2-star Sturmjäger, and in phase C, I bring in my last card of 1-star Jaeger. Being that this is an infantry division, I find it falls really short of some of the other infantry divisions available in the Axis side, be it 14th Infantry from last week, 2 weeks ago when I did 78th Sturm, or even Fallschirmjäger, which I have yet to do. These are all very similar deployments in that they're very specialized towards close quarters, however they pack much better infantry and a few other things that are much better, so Jaeger really struggles in certain areas. It picks it up in the air tab, but sometimes that's not good enough, and we'll get into that when I get into my post-review. In the tank tab, I bring in a phase A card and a phase B card of 1-star Stugs. These are pretty self-explanatory. I use them as just kind of hull lock tanks that I scattered around the outskirts of battles and kind of kept everything in like goalies. In the support tab, we have a really unique unit that's kind of hiding in plain sight, and that's the Jaeger Flammenwerfer. These guys are unique in that they carry 2 flamethrowers instead of just 1, bringing them up to 20 points and nerfing their availability down to 6 at no stars. However, they're still capable of coming in on the motorbikes, which makes them excellent. On top of this, they will beat enemy Ognjimachiki, enemy flamethrowers, or any enemy squad that's like that without any issue. 2 flamethrowers is better than 1, and these guys just blow enemy infantry out of the water because of it. Using these to support Jaeger in heavy forests really means that the Jaeger will get the upper hand on units like the Tanko Desetniki or the Ognjimachiki without losing too many members of their own squad. Past this, I bring in the Jaeger MG42 in the horse transport. Again, fairly self-explanatory. These guys were just there to pin down infantry in the open, and the MG42 is pretty overpowered right now. It's pretty broken, and it's great. I also bring in a Phase A Commander and a Phase A card of the IG-33s. Now I bring the IG-33s in the SDKFZ transport with the MG-42 mounted to the top, but this is kind of optional. I just bring it in because it's a little bit faster than some of the other options. On top of this, I bring in the IG-33 because I'm bringing in the IG-18s in Phase B, and the IG-33 will help me pin down infantry, especially those mid-ranged infantry when I'm struggling to fight against them as Jaeger in, say, a city or an open forest. In Phase B, I bring in those aforementioned IG-18s to help me deal with enemy transports, enemy half-tracks, really any of those options, as well as help pin down those infantry still. I round out the support tab with a supply truck. In the anti-tank tab, I bring in the PAC 184R 45mm. It's an M42. I don't know why they went through so much trouble. It's just an M42. I also bring in a Phase A card of the Panzer Jaeger. These guys are interesting units. They're still capable of coming in the horse transport, means that they're just as fast as typical Panzerschreck teams. However, they're 6 men strong, and so they're kind of bulky and not very stealthy is a good way of putting it. If I had it my way, I would bring in regular Panzerschreck teams, however Jaeger doesn't get access to them. These guys are bulky, and so they will survive a shot from an enemy IS-2 that they sneaked up on. However, they're not able to sneak as efficiently, and on top of that, all of their weapons that they carry are MP40s, so if they end up using those MP40s, things have already gone off the rails. So it's usually not great to have them in the first place. Past that, I bring in a card of the PAC 38 50mm, one of my favorite AT guns in the game, and round it all out with a Phase B card of the PAC 40s. Again, a great AT gun just to round out that tab. The AT tab is actually quite strong in this division comparatively to the rest of the division. In the robust and voluptuous AA tab, I bring in a Phase B card of Flak 43s. Now I could have brought in other units, yada yada yada, but the Flak 43 really was the only thing that performed well enough for me. I had toyed around throughout the week with bringing in the Flak 38 trucks, especially because they travel incredibly quickly on roads, but I found that I was using them more often than not to pin down enemy infantry in the opening, and they were just dying at that time, so it was kind of a waste of a 2-point slot. In the artillery tab, I brought in my new favorite artillery unit, the Geb 105s. These have been my favorite for a little while now, as they're just incredible units. I really enjoy using them. Past that, I bring in one card of the 210mm off-map observers. I just needed off-map just to get those early footholds, as you know, and the other option was a plane, and those typically end in terror for me, so I just stuck with the 210, even though it only gets 2 shots. In Phase B, I bring in a card of the Battery Führer, as well as a card of the Nebelwerfer 42 in the supply truck. This hikes the price up to an incredible 155, but the Nebelwerfer is actually super good in this division. I don't know why I've ever talked trash about it before. On top of that, being able to hook it up to the supply truck that it rode in on and drive it away before counter battery is able to find it is an excellent boon. Lastly, I round out the artillery tab with the 150mm artillery pieces, again coming in the supply trucks, just to sort of get that counter battery online late or help me deal with heavier tanks or infantry emplacements later in the game. In the air tab, which was ostensibly the selling point of this division, I started off with a FW-190 ATAC-8 in Phase A at 2 stars. This is because I don't like buying more than one aircraft if one aircraft can do the job, so I really splurged on the veterancy on these. In Phase B, I bring in another 2-star card of the air superiority fighters, as well as one of the fighter-bomber variants, the F8, 4 per card, 115 points each. These guys are just excellent at dropping munitions quickly, getting out without enemy aircraft fire, or by being hunted down by anything short of a Typhoon or a Tempest. In Phase C, I bring in the typical 1 trillion bombers in the form of the HE-111, H-TAC-21s. These all have basically the same munitions, just broken up into different armaments. Some of them drop many bombs, some of them drop a few bombs, all of them drop 1 trillion bombs on IS-2s, and that's what I use them for. Something worth noting about the HE-111 is that it's not quite as tanky as, say, the Ju-188 or as the PE-2, and I'm not entirely sure what that is. It could be a speed thing, could be a resilience thing, but these guys were less likely to drop their bombs and get out as some of those other bombers are. Moving on to Jaeger at the end of the week, a few things have changed. One, the KFZ-4, I know our favorite unit in the recon tab, has been dropped. I ended up bringing in the Spearhead instead, as the recon change went live this week when I was playing this, and so I was really into bringing in these recon units. The Spearhead were a little bit better than the Aufklärer at staying alive, so I brought them in for that reason. I was kind of just posting these guys up everywhere to really help spot for the heavy tanks that were on my team. Say I was playing with the King Tiger division, I just put a bunch of Spearhead up for him just to spot for his King Tigers. The Infantry tab didn't see any change, as I felt it was as good as it was going to get. Perhaps there's a way to play it better, I just didn't know a way to make it better. Neither did the Tank or Support tab, or the Anti-Tank tab for that matter. The only other change we see past the KFZ-4 drop is in the Air tab, where I've rescinded my earlier statement and brought in my ASF at 1 star rather than 2 stars, as I just remembered somewhere in the middle of the week that I didn't have any AA in this division, and this would be my only form of plane deterrent. Still at 1 star, and with a trillion of them flying through the air, these guys were more often routed before they killed enemy planes or dissuaded enemy planes, even when I kept them orbiting close to the front line. This deck was actually pretty frustrating to play, and I imagine that it would be frustrating in almost any game mode. Regardless of the amount of players, you're almost incapable of holding a front all by yourself, and even in the fronts you're capable of holding, it's only barely. This deck really lends itself toward that sort of meme gameplay of wait until late game, hit them with a trillion planes and artillery, and that's it, that's the whole game plan. I even remember watching a stream once where Taiga was trying to optimize his Jaeger division by talking to Gonzo, and both of them had decided that the division was practically worthless. I assume they were talking about 1v1s, but I don't think that that really stops at 1v1s. In fact, I dare say that this issue becomes more pronounced in team games simply because you're going to have to bother your allies for a lot of help. Something that I think really hurts this division is the fact that once you lose an area, say you lose a city or lose a forest, retaking that area becomes incredibly difficult, much more so than fighting for the area in the first place. And this is simply due to the fact that all your infantry have such tiny range increments. If you lose a forest and the enemy is able to set up, then oftentimes you're just doomed to never retake that forest without the help of gratuitous off-map artillery or planes. Aside from using a ton of smoke, it's almost impossible to get your Jaeger or Sturmjäger back into position to actually help out in the conflict, and this is only exacerbated by the fact that you only get 12 tanks. I think the closest cousin to this division is probably 78th Sturm, being that it boasts a lot of the same capabilities. Where Sturm shines is it has such a multitude of different great infantry options that are capable of retaking areas or holding them to begin with. Not only that, but it also boasts a lot of really great support units and better anti-tank capability. As if that wasn't bad enough, you can bring in more Stugs in 78th Sturm also. Really, the only place that this deck overperforms over Sturm is in its ability to bring in the Nebelwerfer 42 and in its air tab, which is much more robust than Sturm's. However, that robustness aside, it's suffering on quite a few very crucial areas for team games, one of those being anti-air, but more specifically on great usable infantry, which this deck completely lacks. I found that some of the games that I played with this division, I was just the meat shield for better infantry behind me, just using my Jaeger to kind of absorb shots from the enemy on the front lines, while somebody else's infantry actually killed things. Despite me saying that these guys are great in close quarters, which they are for what it's worth, it's very difficult to get them into those situations without a lot of micromanaging and babysitting, and because of that, that makes this division very difficult to play and very taxing while you're playing it. All in all, I never felt as though when I was playing this division I was an active contributor in our wins. I felt like I was just along for the ride, having not lost entirely in whatever front I'd chosen to go to. Comparatively to America, which I also played this week, I lost probably 60% of the games that I played with 28th Jager, and some of those were my fault, just watching as my entire front collapsed with nothing I could do about it. On top of all this deck is something of an anomaly. Being that it brings in the Stugs, it has a very good hull-locked medium tank that can sit on the outskirts of conflict. However, being that all of its infantry boasts such close-ranged weaponry, you're bound to be fighting in forests or in cities where the Stug is incapable of also fighting. Because of this division is practically begging for an SPW 233, 231, or Panzer 3 or 4 just to really help these infantry out in those close quarters engagements. Even in areas that I was able to win with my infantry, I was soon just overwhelmed with Shermans or with T-34 76s that I just had no way to deal with inside of the close confines of the city. I would actually say that this deck is really difficult to play well. Not to win with, as I think it is a very winnable deck if you get into the late game, just due to the amount of artillery and planes that you're capable of bringing in. If your teammates are also playing well, then you're probably going to win with this division. However, in order to actively play well and overtake the enemy, you're going to have to put a lot more into it than that, and I think that makes this very difficult to play. All in all, my consensus on this division is if you're looking to play a division just like this, just play 78th Sturm or one of the other infantry divisions such as 14th that get access to a lot better things while still having these great infantry. All in all though, that is going to do it for this week in review of 3rd US Armored Spearhead and 28th Jaeger. Next week will be 2E Blindé French deployment and 122nd Infantry on the Axis side. Quick reminder that if you have any interesting divisions that you'd like to suggest, leave it in the comments and I'll either get to it in chronological order or I'll route you to where it already exists. But bear in mind that I am quite backed up as I'm currently about 3 weeks in behind, so it might be a little while before we see your division, or your division might be one of the earlier suggestions and I'll let you know if that's the case. Thank you guys for watching, and as always I hope you learned something.